Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Macquarie's global headquarters. My name's Kevin McCann, and I'm chairman of Macquarie, and I'm also a director of the US Studies Centre. So I've welcome you in both capacities. This building, for those of you who are here for your first time, is a early 20th century building. It used to be the headquarters of the Commonwealth Bank, and I'm delighted to say we adapted it in a very innovative fashion, and it's now fit for the 21st century. And as I said, it's the headquarters of Macquarie worldwide. The US Studies Centre was formed some 10 years ago, and its mission was to increase the understanding of the USA in Australia. We're now 10 years old, and the Centre seeks to inform the community on US through a non-partisan and academically rigorous policy of research, undergraduate and postgraduate teaching. We host a number of American experts and fellows, and we're working on projects to strengthen ties between Australia and the United States. The Centre's experts cover foreign policy, defence, trade, economics, history, culture, and of course US politics. We have a very flourishing undergraduate program. The most popular course is called Sex, Drugs and Rock, and that has over 1,000 students. So that's extremely successful. And we have a very good exchange program with the United States, where 150 young Australians study in the US and also are interns. Now, we've all been following the US presidential campaign. In fact, you have no option if you watch television. One of the interesting is one of the issues which has been dominating Republican debates, at least, is how the United States should deal with ISIS, or I think it's called Daesh, isn't it, if you're an Arabist. And polling from the Pew Centre has shown that Republican voters are very concerned about the international security risks that ISIS is causing to America. In fact, 66% of Republicans and 48% of Democrats now nominate ISIS as a critical threat to America's security. So understanding ISIS and framing a response is at the forefront of the presidential candidates, both Republican and Democrat. So we're delighted to have Dr. David Kilcullen here to talk about the complexities of ISIS, as well as Australian and American strategies to counter the activities. And I'll get our chairman, Mark Bailey, to introduce David and give you some background about him. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Kevin, and also let me express my thanks to Macquarie for hosting the event this evening. As Kevin said, my name is Mark Bailey. I'm the chairman of the US Studies Centre at Sydney University, and we're delighted that you could be here this evening to participate in this forum and dialogue with Dr. Kilcullen. Just remind people at the start if they could just please put their mobile devices to silent so that we can all hear the proceedings. We're very pleased tonight to be able to host David and for the launch of his book, Blood Year, which I think most of you or all of you should have received copies as you came into the room. I'm sure you'll find it a very interesting read. This evening what we're going to do, I will introduce David. He will come and speak for a little while, and then James Brown, our research director, will come and have, I guess, a fireside chat with David about some of the issues that confront us today. And then we'll open the floor for Q&A after that. So just in terms of David, he's a very experienced person in this field. He was drafted from the Australian military to advise the US State Department, senior leaders, Condoleezza Rice being one, on the strategy and counterinsurgency, particularly in the Middle East. He was engaged as an advisor to General David Petraeus was intimately involved in the surge that occurred that ultimately led to the final success in Iraq in 2007 and turned the tide of that conflict. He's a prolific author, and many of you would have read some of David's quite sobering op-ed pieces in the Australian press, in the Australian of recent times. I must admit, reading them, I feel quite depressed at the end of them. But I think that's David doesn't pull any punches. He's realistic. He tells it like it is. Having said that, I was at a function with David in LA just a few weeks ago as part of the G'day program, and with Rand Corporation, and his co-speaker was an economist from Rand, whose mission was to actually look at the business structure of ISIL and ISIS. And he said one comment that stuck with me. He said the intelligence they'd received was that that they actually put themselves as a company. They've got different groups and divisions, but the morale in the suicide bombing division was at a very low ebb. So I thought that was an interesting statement. David is now president of Caris Associates, a firm which conducts research and analysis in conflict zones all around the world. Will you please join in welcoming David to the lectern?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you to both the US Study Centre and to Macquarie for hosting the event. As was said, I'm going to spend about 20 minutes laying out some ideas about how to think about ISIS. That's not going to answer any questions, I guess. It's just going to give us a framework for how to describe a very complex phenomenon, and then I hope form the basis for a more detailed conversation, which James and I will start, and then hopefully you guys will join in. So that, to me, is the more important part rather than what I'm going to say. So let me just kind of set the scene to start with. We've already mentioned the fact that there are multiple names for this entity that we're talking about. Some people call it Daesh, the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. Some people call it ISIS. Some people call it the Caliphate. Some people call it IS. There's all these different names, and I think that shows you that we have yet to fully get a grip of exactly what is this thing that we're dealing with. And I want to suggest to you tonight that it's actually not one thing. It's actually three things. It's a central state-like organization that exists in Iraq and Syria. It is a network of 11, soon to be 12, regional terrorist organizations across the Middle East, Africa, and parts of Southeast Asia. And then it's a very amorphous, you might almost say disaggregated network of individuals, probably numbering upwards of about 150,000 in a variety of countries worldwide, perhaps as many as 80 countries worldwide. So let me talk through each of those, because each of them is different and each of them poses different threats. And then we can talk about how to think about dealing with those threats. So let's start at the top, this state-like entity that exists in Iraq and Syria. And I've often been critiqued by people for describing the Islamic State as a state. People say, well, it's a death cult. And in fact, those two things aren't mutually exclusive, right? There have been previous cases where death cults have gained control of states. But I think if we get a little more precise on that, there are a number of different sources in both customary and statutory international law for thinking about what constitutes a state. One of the sources of that is a thing called the Montevideo Convention of 1933 on the rights and duties of the state. It's not the only way of thinking about it, but because the US is a signatory, it's worth thinking about what that convention says are the criteria to be considered a state. A state has to control territory, or it has to exercise effective control over a particular territory. That territory has to have a population. It can't just be uninhabited ground. There have to be people living there. There has to be a government or a governing entity that claims authority over the territory and the population, and that government has to be capable of entering into relations with other states. And the convention goes on to say in Article 10, you don't have to have relations with other states, nor do you have to be recognized as a state by others, but having those criteria sort of puts you in the category of things that have the rights and duties of a state. So if we apply those criteria to the Islamic State in its central entity in Iraq and Syria, I would argue that it meets or nearly meets virtually all those requirements. Right now, it controls a network of about 10 cities across Iraq and Syria, an area in total about the size of the British Isles. It controls a population of around 6 million, so roughly the size of Singapore or one of the smaller Scandinavian countries. It has a government that calls itself the Caliphate, but has not only a military branch, but law courts, a taxation office, an education department, a series of hospitals. It runs schools, it operates power stations and water facilities and so on. So it's a sort of fully articulated state-like structure. And then in addition to all those things, it claims to have relations with other states. So it sells oil and gas on the international market into Turkey and into Syria. It sells electricity. Some people may not be aware, but most of the cities in the central part of Syria that are actually controlled by the Assad regime get their electricity from oil-fired power stations run by ISIS, and ISIS sells that electricity to the regime. It maintains a thing called the Cyber Caliphate, with which it maintains relationships with other like groups, and it engages in negotiations from time to time with state-like entities. So I'm not going to call it a state, but I'm going to say it's a state-like entity or a state-building enterprise. It thinks it's a state, and it most certainly fights like a state. If you look at the tactics adopted by ISIS fighters in Iraq and Syria over the past several years, they're conventional tactics, but using non-conventional means. So maneuver that looks very similar to tank-on-tank maneuver that we might be familiar with from conventional conflict, but just using up-armoured Humvees, in some cases captured tanks, heavy artillery captured from the Iraqi and Syrian regimes. It has at least a couple of helicopters, but so far we've not seen them successfully fly any aircraft. But it certainly has a fairly substantial panoply of military equipment that it uses much as a state would use it. And of course, the leadership group of that central state is about 1/3 former professional military guys from Saddam Hussein's regime or defectors from the Syrian government. So that's the top layer of the layer cake, if you like, or the top layer of the three-dimensional chess game, if you prefer that analogy, the state-like entity. The threat that entity poses is a straight-up geopolitical conventional threat. It is creating millions upon millions of refugees and displaced people. The war that it's sparked in Syria has killed now upwards of 300,000 people, 9 times as many killed by Bashar al-Assad's regime, by the way, than were killed by ISIS. And it's essentially redrawing the map of the Middle East with enormous loss of life, huge impact on the global and regional economy, and all kinds of other things that we're all pretty familiar with in thinking about conventional warfare, right? It does use terrorism. It uses terror to intimidate populations. It also tactically uses terror as an adjunct to military maneuver. But it's not really a terrorist organization in the sense that it's not just a terrorist organization. It does other things as well. It has other pretensions. So that's the top layer. Second layer is what ISIS calls the walayat, which just means provinces or regional territories of the Islamic State. And there are 11 of them, ranging from West Africa through a number of them in North Africa to Afghanistan and Pakistan to Southeast Asia, a number of them across the broader Middle East. And these groups operate much more like a traditional terrorist organization. They carry out terrorist attacks, they run insurgencies. They are, in some ways, superficially a little bit similar to the al-Qaeda franchises that we became used to in places like Yemen and Somalia and so on over the past decade. But they have a very distinct difference, which is that unlike the al-Qaeda franchises, they too are state-building enterprises. They're trying to carve out territory, administer population, hold ground, and create a state. And they're sort of external bridgeheads for a fairly conventional expansion by conquest strategy that is put out by the central Islamic State. So that second layer is much more diverse, right? We're talking about 11 different groups, but you can see some similarities among them. One is they all follow a very strict version of sectarian ideology. So unlike Al-Qaeda, which is really focused on kind of sponsoring a broad popular uprising and partnering with anyone willing to partner with it in order to attack the West, ISIS is very focused on Shia versus Sunni sectarian conflict and basically provoking a Muslim-on-Muslim conflict that is going to generate sufficient violence to basically make the area that it's targeting ungovernable, drive out other states and allow them to inherit the wreckage. And so it's a very different set of strategies, but the tactics become rather similar when you look at the way that they operate. And the threat here is against weak, developing, and in some cases fragile states. States like Nigeria, Libya, Egypt, Yemen, places that already have many other problems going on that are now being afflicted by the emergence of ISIS as well. The third layer is, in some ways, the hardest to get a grip on, but in a domestic counterterrorism sense, it's the most important. And that's what I like to call the international, and I'm consciously referring back to the early Soviet Union of the 1920s by picking that term. What we're looking at here is a very amorphous, atomized group of individuals, small cells, self-radicalized or remotely radicalized people who are not necessarily part of any formal organization. They don't belong to any sort of card-carrying structure like Al-Qaeda. They may have been radicalized online or by contact with people in their social network. Many of them have sought to travel to Iraq and Syria but haven't made it. Some have traveled and returned, and they are engaged in everything from agitation through propaganda, through recruiting, through active terrorist activity on their home territory, in this case our territory of Western states and others. And this is, again, a much more classical sort of terrorism type threat. It's not the 9/11 style threat, though, where we see 20 hijackers sneaking into the United States, mounting an incredibly large scale, what we call a spectacular terrorist attack. It's much smaller scale, lower lethality, but many more examples of these attacks. So 1 or 2 people, up to maybe 5 or 6 people involved, mobile active shooter incidents that look a bit more like a workplace shooting or a mass shooting, incidents like we saw just a few hundred yards away here in Martin Place with the Lindt Cafe siege here in Sydney, incidents like we saw in Parramatta where one 15-year-old kid shot a police employee, very sort of spontaneous and apparently spur of the moment, and therefore much harder to predict and to protect against than the traditional Al-Qaeda style of terrorism. The threat that emanates from that, let's call it the international, is twofold. One is obviously the threat of terrorist attack. I actually don't think that that's the most important threat that comes from them, though. I think the most important threat is the threat that they pose to our way of life, both directly by provoking different groups in the community to look at each other with suspicion, by breaking down a lot of the openness and ability to relate to each other that are kind of fundamental to Western societies like Australia, and also by generating kind of a constant low-level background of suspicion where everyone's kind of looking at each other and thinking, here I am in a big group, who's sitting here has got a backpack bomb, you know? And every time you go into an area with a crowd, you know, just feeling a little bit more nervous than you otherwise would. And I think that sort of constant background threat tends to wear down people's sense of civic solidarity over time. So that's the direct threat. The indirect threat is that in dealing with this very amorphous type of threat, we will indulge in preemptive security measures, intrusive surveillance, really robust policing and intelligence efforts that, on the one hand, may keep us a little bit safer than we otherwise would be, but may also run the risk of destroying the society that they're trying to save. And it's kind of hard to take this seriously standing here in Australia, which is a country where we still broadly trust the institutions of government. We still think about the agencies as largely legitimate. I mean, people criticise the police or the intelligence services here for being incompetent. They don't run around with conspiracy theories that they're trying to take over the state. Now, you can go to the United States, or indeed many countries in Europe today, and you'll see a much darker, less solid relationship between intelligence services, the police, and society, and particularly that subset of society that security agencies call the Muslim community, which is not really a thing, right? It's a way we've decided to describe it in the post-9/11 environment. So again, a very different set of threats at each level. Strong, state-like, conventional, geopolitical threat that's killing a lot of people, destroying the global economy and generating mass damage at the level of the central state. You've got these 11, soon to be 12 groups globally that are trying to carve out territory and form sort of proto-states and ally with the Central Islamic State. And then you've got this amorphous mass of radicalized or self-radicalized individuals. How do we deal with each of those threats? Well, the way that I've described it, I think, tells you what the answer is, right? At the conventional, state-like level, the requirement is for a straight-up military conventional response. It's not a matter of counterinsurgency. It's not even really a matter of counterterrorism. We're talking about large-scale urban warfare in cities that are controlled by an enemy with tanks. Whether we want to engage in that, whether we have the stomach for that fight, that's a different question, right? But if you want to deal with that threat, that's what's required. When you look at the regional terrorist threats, again, it's fairly obvious what we need to be doing. We need to be working with regional partners. We need to be engaging in the kinds of reform efforts and foreign assistance efforts that can help them cope with those kinds of threats. And we need to be helping them to share information, both with us and with each other, as a way of better protecting against the threat. Again, that's pretty obvious, and it's something that we've known about for a long time. And Australia is actually one example of a country that's done pretty well in doing that kind of regional partnership. But globally, there are two problems that we've seen with our response to date. One is that we focus much too much on the assistance and capability development and not enough on the reform element. So we end up teaching corrupt cops to be more efficient corrupt cops, and we end up teaching oppressive militaries to shoot straight. And that doesn't necessarily help you when the problem is that people don't like the government. So I think reconceiving of some of what we're doing in reform terms is really important, but also resourcing it. We're talking about a very large-scale effort and a long-term effort, and one that isn't going to be over overnight. And then finally, at the local level, I think that the deal is, it's policing. It is particularly community policing and community engagement. It's intelligence work in a fairly light footprint kind of a way that respects people's human rights, but also tries to figure out ways to predictively understand the kinds of threats that are out there. But I also think fundamentally we need to recognise that nothing we can do and no amount of intrusive police state activity in our own society is going to guarantee that there will not be a terrorist attack in Australia. There have already been 3 since 9/11. Security services have foiled at least another 6 in that same time frame. So we know that the threat is out there, but that's not necessarily a reason to engage in heavy-handed policing or preemptive security. I think at some level we have to accept that this stuff is going to happen, and that the price of having an open society that we all want to live in is that fairly often this sort of stuff is going to take place for the foreseeable future. Final thought, then I'll throw to James and we can have a bit of a conversation. As we think about these sort of 3 layers of threat, I've described them as separate, but of course they're not. They're actually very closely connected. And when we take action against one layer, they can react at a different layer. So I do think that we need to be focusing on rolling back the ISIS central state in Iraq and Syria. But don't think that by doing that, we're going to necessarily reduce terrorism at home. It's actually a different problem set. And ISIS has actually shown that when it loses ground in Iraq, as it's doing now, or in Syria, as it has at different times in the past, it lashes out at the level of the wilayats, at the level of the regional provinces. So the Paris attack in November last year was in part a response to pressure being put on the Islamic State in Syria and in Iraq. Similarly, when our partners do well in confronting threats at the regional level, we sometimes see a spillover of violence into the domestic level of the international. So that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be dealing with the threat to the global system that is the Central Islamic State. But that doesn't mean that by doing that, we'll be necessarily reducing the threat at home. And we may, in fact, just unfortunately need to get with the fact that we're going to be dealing with an elevated terrorism threat for the foreseeable future. So I don't want to end on a bad note, and I'm not. We're going to have a conversation now, and you guys, I hope, will get to pose whatever questions you want to pose later on. So James.
Thanks, David. And look, I think people in this building have known a few economists. They know that they deal in pessimism. You've just reminded me why it is that they say that strategists deal in cataclysm. So hopefully we can find a few bright spots in sort of the firmament of the world of ISIS. I just want to thank you for providing such a clear breakdown of this group. It's complex and it's rare that you sort of get an encapsulation of it in that way that helps you sort of understand just how many levels you need to face a campaign on for this group. I want to start by looking at the US response to ISIS that we've seen over the last few years and then asking you about some of the other players in this morass who are sort of behind the current efforts to negotiate a ceasefire in Syria, but who will also be decisive in turning around some of these problems in the Middle East. Yeah. In the book, you sort of have this to say about President Obama, and you make the point that it's not a partisan criticism of Obama, but you say his inaction in Egypt and Libya, his failure to support democracy in Syria and Iran, his reliance on unilateral drone strikes signalled weakness to Iran and Russia and midwifed the rebirth of ISIS. You are not getting invited to President Obama's farewell party, but where did he go wrong with his response to this problem? How did he misread it? How did he sort of tie himself in?
Yeah. So let me start by just acknowledging something you just said, which is that's not a partisan attack on Obama. If you think that's critical, you should see what I wrote about President Bush in the book. And certainly not getting invited to any of their Christmas parties either. I think you've got to recognise, and I think it's obvious to Australians as much as to Americans, that when you go through a change of government, people tend to vote out one government and vote for kind of the opposite, and Obama was voted in as basically the anti-Bush. And that's exactly what people wanted, and that's certainly what we got. So President Bush was very unilateral. He was kind of reckless. He didn't think things through. He delegated decision-making authority to probably too low of a level to people like Rumsfeld and others in his cabinet, and didn't really take the reins of the problem until the time of the surge in Iraq. And that created this massive strategic mess that we're dealing with now. President Obama was elected to be the opposite, and that's exactly what he was. He was not unilateral. He tended to coordinate with, if anything, too many countries and try to lead from behind. And that meant that often the response was lowest common denominator rather than exercising leadership, sort of working on a consensus basis. He also centralized decision-making in his own hands very tightly. And that actually created a bit of a bottleneck in the decision-making process where, unlike the Bush administration where all kinds of people were big imperial players within the administration, in the case of the Obama administration, it's a very small group of 3 to 4 people that make virtually all the decisions, and decisions have to be staffed up to them. And you end up with 2 or 3 what we call principals committee meetings, so cabinet meetings essentially, every week. Where there's almost a paralysis by analysis in terms of thinking about the situation. And I also think that where President Bush sort of didn't think through far enough ahead what was going to be the outcome of some decisions, the Obama administration is very good about projecting out all the really difficult things that may come up if we do this or if we do that, and that tends to prevent them from taking decisive action quickly when things come up. And you mentioned the inaction in the face of Syria, and I think that's probably the classic example, where we had at different times, at least at the beginning of the war in 2011, certainly in August 2013, the opportunity to dramatically alter the course of events in Syria without committing troops or without engaging in military action necessarily, although 2013, that was certainly on the table. But we missed those opportunities. And one of the issues here is path dependency, right? We're locked into a set of decisions that are narrowed by all the previous decisions we've made, and now we're faced with a fairly narrow set of, frankly, bad choices as a result of that.
So, Russia and Iran both have intervened at different times with different objectives, but you see them fairly unified in what they want. I mean, what are they trying to do, particularly in Syria?
So people are probably aware that there's some very serious fighting going on north of Aleppo, which is the second largest city in Syria right now. And that is, in my view, is a coordinated Russian-Iranian effort to get themselves into the strongest possible negotiating position before the beginning of talks, which we expect to happen in the next week or two. And the reason for that is, as you mentioned, they've got very clear and fairly unified strategic objectives. We have intervened in Syria against ISIS, but it's not really clear what we're intervening in favour of. It's very clear that they're intervening in favour of the Assad regime. Not necessarily Bashar al-Assad himself, by the way, right? Neither the Iranians nor the Russians have a particularly close personal relationship with Bashar al-Assad, but they want to preserve their own geostrategic interests. So in the case of Russia, it is the naval base at Tartus. It's their long-standing relationship with the Syrian regime. It's their influence in the region. And they're essentially pursuing what they're doing in Ukraine, trying to create almost a frozen conflict where they preserve their interests even if the conflict isn't solved. The Iranians are looking at something different. After the Axis of Evil speech in 2002, they essentially decided that they needed to create a whole deterrent structure ranging from a nuclear program through efforts in Iraq to efforts in Afghanistan as a way of deterring any future US attack on the Islamic Republic. And for them, it's about expanding that buffer zone as far as they can. And if you think about it, the Iranians are on the verge of controlling territory all the way from Herat in Western Afghanistan to the Golan Heights on the Israeli border. And that's kind of the drive that they're pushing forward. I would just say the Iranians and the Russians are not unified in every way. They do have different interests and they do see the problem differently. But in this case, they're unified in trying to support the incumbents in both Iraq and Syria. And we are the only player out there that's not either trying to overthrow both the Iraqi and the Syrian government or to protect both the Iraqi and the Syrian government. We're the only ones out there that are trying to overthrow one and protect the other, right? So every time we do something on one side of the border that helps our interests, it hurts us on the other.
So we've got the more difficult problems, so we've also got the more sort of difficult partners, I guess. I don't know whether difficult is the right word, but how would you characterise particularly US allies in the region and the way they're sort of approaching the problem of Syria first and then ISIS overall?
Well, I do think, as you mentioned earlier, that the intervention of the Russians into the problem in the Middle East has really changed the calculus for a lot of allies who now have an alternative to the US coalition, which many felt was, as I said in the book, kind of feckless over the past few years. And now you've got the Russians who at least are giving the appearance of being a robust alternative. And people as diverse as some players in Israel, through people in Turkey, through the Iraqi cabinet, are thinking maybe we're better to preserve our options and not necessarily throw our lot in with the US. So I think that's definitely changed the perception of regional allies. I would just also call out Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon, all of which have carried this immense burden of refugees and displaced people from both Iraq and Syria for a number of years now, and are really struggling to sustain that. And of course, the overflow of refugees into Europe is in part because these countries have just reached saturation point and haven't really been given the assistance that they really need in order to sustain that flow of displaced people.
So, I mean, Australia is engaged in this fight. Australia's got a voice in the coalition against ISIS. How would you characterise Australia's involvement in this campaign? Is it the right level? Is it too much? Is it too little? How would you approach it differently?
Australia's level of participation, I think, is about right. We are the second largest contingent in Iraq. We are one of the earliest participants in the air campaign, both Iraq and Syria. Right at the beginning of the Western-led intervention in Iraq in 2014, Australian aircraft were dropping humanitarian supplies to the Yazidis when they were encircled on Mount Sinjar, some of the first humanitarian supplies to get to them. We've been there right from the outset. But if you were to sit down with Americans and say, who's the second largest contingent operating, they wouldn't know it was us. I think we have probably done about as much as we need to do in order to be a serious contributor and player in the alliance. There's always more you could do in terms of resettling refugees and providing humanitarian assistance. So that's there, and it's something that is worth thinking about. But in terms of military commitment, I think we've probably given about as much as we need to give at this point. I certainly would not recommend, ground troops or, massive escalation in air power, because Australia's participation, important though it is not going to be decisive, right? It'll be US, Russia, and others that really set the tone at the peace talks for what happens in Syria. and then obviously for what's going to take place in Iraq.
So let me change direction a little bit. I mean, your company, your contacts, you've got a wide network in the region. In the book, you talk a little bit about some of the contact you've had with people who were in Palmyra, or information you've had on people who've fallen under ISIS in that city. You talk a little bit about what it was like to have Mosul conquered by ISIS. I mean, what is life like inside the Islamic State for people who aren't part of Islamic State?
Well, it's pretty bad. It's not unlivable. I mean, you can survive. And as we've said, there's 6 million people right now living under Islamic State. It's a state of fear. People are continually worried. They are getting fairly effective rudimentary services like water, food, fuel, and so on from the Islamic State. There's a very strict justice code, which is ironically kind of reassuring for a lot of people because they lived in such a chaotic environment for a long time that when someone comes in and says, here's the rules, and you follow these rules, you'll be safe, that makes people kind of reassured. But there is, in fact, an armed opposition against ISIS in many of the cities that they control, including in Mosul. There's a group in Mosul called the Free Officers Movement that actually assassinated the ISIS governor of West Mosul last year. There's even an armed opposition in Raqqa. There are people out there doing anti-ISIS graffiti in many cities that they control. So we tend to regard the population as kind of passive hostages held hostage by ISIS. Assad and the Russians tend to regard them as active accomplices of ISIS. That's why they bomb with relatively little concern for civilian casualties. I think the truth's kind of somewhere in between, right? They're not really passive. Many of them are active and actively opposed to ISIS. Remember also that ISIS doesn't have to be good, because the people it's competing with is Assad and the Shia sectarian regime of Nouri al-Maliki, which was assassinating Sunnis and carrying out sweeps against them before the middle of 2014. So they just have to be better than those guys. So that old joke of you don't have to outrun the grizzly bear, you just have to outrun the person that you're hiking with, right? And so that's the dynamic that we've got. They don't have to be great. They just have to be better than these dictatorships, or better than Assad.
And you also make the point that on relative balance of groups. I mean, you make the point that one of the groups in this campaign, Jabhat al-Nusra, now has somehow managed to successfully paint itself as the more moderate opposition, right?
Right. I mean, it's like Donald Trump standing next to Sarah Palin. Like, looks very rational by comparison, but in fact is not, right? I mean, so Jabhat al-Nusra has successfully painted itself as the thinking man's alternative, right? The sort of more moderate version. That's not really the case. They have a different strategy. They're much more Syrian than they are Iraqi. The leader of al-Jilani, the leader of Jabhat al-Nusra, has spoken, and I quote him in the book at various times, fairly soothingly, to say, look, we're all in this together. We want to overthrow Assad. We're not here to dictate what the form of the state should be after that. We'll all make that decision once we've successfully overthrown Assad. In classical insurgency terms, they're running a popular front strategy, right? They're trying to get as many people on board as they can. They're not running the sectarian strategy that ISIS is running. But when Jabhat al-Nusra captured Dishr al-Sugur, which is a town in northern Syria last spring, they beheaded 480 people in the main square of the city, right? Much like we've seen ISIS do. The difference is they didn't put it on TV, right? They kept it secret. So whereas ISIS is broadcasting that and saying, we're really bad, be frightened of us, and trying to provoke violence by atrocity, the Jabhat al-Nusra guys are like, hey, nothing to see here, we're all good. And they're running a very different kind of a strategy. But certainly, I would argue, pretty dangerous. And if ISIS were not there, we would still have to be really worried about Jabhat al-Nusra.
So I want to ask you a question about the ceasefire that's on the table in Syria. I mean, I think it's pretty remarkable that Kerry and others have been able to get the players to the table to agree to something, but this doesn't involve everyone, right? How do you see this playing out? How do you see this ceasefire working?
Well, firstly, I think it's a massively positive step, right? I mean, Secretary Kerry's been working on this for months. There's been many starts and stops. Staffan de Mistura, who's the UN envoy, has been working closely on this as well. Even my teams have been out there at different times providing support to the peace process. It's really important. There are a lot of Syrian peace activists that have told us, look, it's better than nothing, right? We want to get people at the table to start the discussion. But as you point out, there are two really important groups that are not involved in this peace discussion, and they're the two that we've just been talking about, ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, which together dispose of about 50,000 troops across Iraq and Syria. So there's a really important player that's not in the peace process. And that's a real problem, right? Because right now the idea is that the Assad regime will meet with the so-called moderate or secular rebel groups, that they'll agree to a ceasefire, they'll engage in confidence-building measures as a result of that, and then there'll be a process of reconciliation where there'll be a transitional government or a provisional government that will result in a referendum or some other method of deciding who Syrians want to be their government going forward. There's a dispute between the West and Russia and Iran on what happens to Assad personally. Does he have to step down at the beginning of that process? Does he get to preside over it? Frankly, having some experience as a diplomat, that's not irreconcilable. That sort of stuff, you can work that out. But the problem is you still got ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra, right? So let's imagine that by magic tomorrow, we make a perfect peace deal, and suddenly we're into a reconstruction and post-conflict stabilization environment in Syria, trying to implement that peace deal. 11 million displaced people, half the country destroyed, 400,000 people killed, 1.1 million people now in Europe, many of them from Syria. It's going to take 10 to 20 years to put Syria back together again, possibly several 100,000 UN or international peacekeepers to support that kind of, like Bosnia on steroids, to support that kind of process. And you're doing that when you still have Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS kicking around in the environment, who of course are going to be attacking you as soon as you get in there. So we run the risk, I think, of getting ourselves back into something that looks a hell of a lot like the Iraq War after 2003. So I think, again, you think it through and you think about where this is heading, and I think you realise that this problem's not going away anytime soon. We're going to be stuck with this, even on the best possible case, for a long time to come.
And for the sort of ISIS Internationale, as you described it, what do you think 2016 will show for them? What will they do?
I don't know. Do you think I should go French or Italian? Are we going Internationale? The reason I use that term is because I'm referring back to the early days of communism, right? When there was this Internationale, the Comintern, right, which was basically fraternal parties in a variety of countries, and then individuals who were sort of self-organising to support that in support of a global communist agenda. And in the early 1920s, you had this revolutionary state in the Soviet Union that wanted to overthrow the world order as part of a global revolution. By the mid-20s, Stalin's come in and is talking about socialism in one country, and the Soviet Union kind of settled down to being a relatively normal member of the international state system, albeit a pretty obnoxious one, at different times. But nonetheless, a member of the state system. You can see a similar thing with the Islamic Republic of Iran, where in 1979, 1980, right after the revolution, they had this global Islamic revolutionary agenda, and they were sponsoring groups globally, and there was a support network that was working for them. And by 1981, largely thanks to Saddam, by the way, right, with the Iran-Iraq War, they had settled down into a more sort of standard kind of revolutionary or revisionist nation state. I think it's possible. I don't think it's likely, but it's at least possible that might happen to ISIS as well, that it might be sort of contained and stop expanding and maybe formally maintain its revolutionary agenda, but sort of settle down into controlling the terrain that it has now. And what would that mean for the Internationale? What it meant in the case of both Russia and Iran was that they kind of joined local legal parties, or they travelled to the parent state and tried to become part of it. And we may well see that. I think in the case of Australia, we're seeing many more people being part of that larger recruitment base than we've seen in the past, and some really significant differences, right, between the people we see now and the people we saw, say, for Al-Qaeda 10 years ago. So I think that those demographics are going to change how this goes. And one of the things that I noticed, and I'm sure everyone's aware of this, is how young many of these people are. They have decades ahead of them of political and military action. So this is, again, something that's not going to go away.
Let me finish by asking you to sort of imagine January next year in Washington, D.C., the coronation of President Trump, Vice President Palin, looking for advice on how to make good on their promises to destroy ISIS and strong-arm everybody in the region. There are sort of two parts of your book, and I'd just be interested in asking you how you would advise a future US president, or for that matter, an Australian Prime Minister, how to navigate between the two poles. And the first one is, your book is really a story, a caution against vacillation. The Financial Times has a great review of the book today, which finishes by saying, this should be read by those who still cling to the debris of the fences they sat on over Iraq and Syria, right? So this is a book that's about being careful not to let problems fester without treatment. But you've also cautioned against sort of rash action and unintended consequences. So what would you say to President Trump to keep him in the middle of those two poles?
Thank you for that image. I think it is, just as an aside, it's time we started taking the possibility of a Trump presidency seriously. Right? And whatever you think of the man himself, he's likely to come in with a particular view of the problem. But remember, presidents come in with very limited understanding of the classified material. They come in with generally a domestic agenda, and they say whatever they have to say to get elected as far as foreign policy is concerned. Then rapidly, when they get in office, they discover, oh, you know what? I don't have a huge amount of leverage on the domestic agenda, and many of them turn to foreign policy as an area where they can make their mark. Trump has said that he gets his foreign policy advice from the morning shows. So I doubt that I'd be asked to give advice unless I was to start a morning show. I suppose I could start a morning show specifically directed at the president.
How early are we talking? Infomercial or sort of breakfast?
I don't know. Maybe
because if it's infomercial, we could do something.
Yeah, like a shopping channel. Yeah. But no, I think the advice that I would give would be, to use a rugby analogy, you need to take it on the burst, right? You need to decide before the 20th of January when you get inaugurated, what are you going to do? You need to have your plans in place and not have a big hiatus between inauguration and figuring out what you're going to do. In the case of the Obama administration, we had a 9-month break. It took for almost till November of 2009 to figure out what we were going to do in Afghanistan. That's too long. That was a lost year in Afghanistan, and we're still dealing with the effects of that. In the case of the Bush administration, they came in knowing pretty much exactly what they wanted to do, but then the situation changed around them on 9/11. So I think have a bit of a clear idea. The second thing is without being too arrogant, read my book. It's not that complicated, right? It's complicated, but it ain't that complicated. It's 3 layers. We know where it came from. We know what those basic threats are, and we know that we need to coordinate among them. One of the issues in the States is that this thing's become incredibly partisan. So people are talking past each other, and people are almost putting forward alternate versions of history about what happened. And so what I've tried to do in the book here is to actually capture, what did really happen and what we know, as a non-political, what I saw from both those administrations. And I hope that someone in each administration, whether it's a Clinton administration or a Trump administration or a Sanders administration or a Rubio, goes back and reads that and says, oh yeah, I remember that now. I'll end with one anecdote, and I told this a couple of days ago, but I think it's relevant. End of 2012, I was out in a place called Dayak, which is in far southeastern Afghanistan, right? Totally isolated little Navy SEAL outpost in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by Taliban, getting attacked like every night. And I was about to fly out of there, and the Navy radio operator on the helipad looked about 12. And I said to the guy, how old are you, mate? And I was like, I'm 19 years old, right? This is December 2012. So that guy was in primary school on 9/11. And that's the other reason why I wrote the book, because a lot of us remember 9/11 and we remember what happened. But there's people now that are fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of them on their 2nd or 3rd tour in the military, who were in primary school when that attack happened. And many of them have never heard, like, how did we get here? And it's almost like now we're waking up after a big party, with a big hangover, and we're like, how did we get here? And so partly what I'm trying to do here is to say, hey, there's a history here, and we need to think about how that happened so we can understand where to go next. I do hope that the US ends up with, as Australia ends up with, a political leadership that it deserves and that is able to take this forward to the next phase.
Look, we've got about 20 minutes for questions. I know there'll be a few, so what I would ask is if you can make yourself known to our people who are carrying microphones around the room, ask clear and quick questions. We'll be able to get through more that way, and we'll try and perhaps group some as we go along. But where can I take the first question from? Okay, first question up the back. And then the second question I'll take from the middle of this group here. And apologies for those of you who are hidden to me behind the lectern.
I'm James Dodaro, and I direct the Center for National Security Studies here at Sydney. Thanks for the book. And really, thanks for the, I just got the book, and I just read the epigram by Nietzsche, which says, you know, if you fight with monsters, beware you might become one, but also if you stare into the abyss, it will stare back at you, which suggests that we're in a reactive, active situation, that perhaps even the counter-violence has been worse than the original violence. Maybe I'm wrong, but what I want you to respond to is really something else Nietzsche said, that insanity or madness is rare among individuals, but it's quite common among nation states. And then he goes on to say, also political groups. So how do you break that cycle that we see the US has been caught in for some time now, almost it's like imitative. It's like we play into the hands of Al-Qaeda, we play into the hands of ISIS. And I know you pride yourself on being a professional soldier and not being political, but I say you have to deal with this mimetic relationship if you're ever going to get out of this cycle of violence and counter-violence. So,
Yeah.
your advice.
So firstly, I fully agree with you, James. It is I call it evolution and co-evolution, right? Where we do something, they respond, we react, they react, and we co-evolve, right, together into a sort of almost a codependent relationship. And that's very true of actually all civil wars, where once the violence starts, it sort of develops a life of its own and it continues to roll. That's certainly true here as well. I'll answer your question by referring to something that I say in the book, in the last section of the book, which is that we have certainly gone through many reform efforts since 9/11 on the military side. And I think the military piece of it, we've actually begun to do reasonably well. The issue is not that the military doesn't know how to fight terrorists or it doesn't know how to do counterinsurgency. The issue is that our nations don't know how to translate battlefield success into peace and political stability going forward. And that's the piece where I think we really need to be focusing our effort, what academics would call war termination, right? And the kinds of issues about translating a change on the ground into a better environment going forward. And you know, you could pour vast amounts of money and huge amounts of organisational change effort into the military and trying to fix the military. That's not going to fix the problem, because I would argue it's really not a military problem. It's a problem of the civil-military relations and translating one into the other.
Next question down here.
Hi, my name is Jay Hannon. I have a very short question. Who is funding and sponsoring ISIS, and is ISIS vulnerable to being cut off?
In financial terms?
Yes.
Yeah. ISIS is really now self-funding and self-sponsoring. It generates about $1 million or slightly less per day in revenue. That revenue has actually been cut significantly lately as a result of low global oil prices. And in fact, ISIS about 6 weeks ago had to cut the pay of its fighters in half because it didn't have the oil revenue to support them anymore. But this is why I say it's not really a classic terrorist group. It's much more like a state, right? It's self-sustaining. It's probably got an annual income of about $500 million. And that's like out of the charts in terms of terrorist groups historically. It does have relations with other states, but generally they're sort of below the radar. It trades oil, it trades electricity. Another factor that's not widely known is that the Iraqi and the Syrian government are still paying the salaries of civilians who are inside ISIS-controlled territory. So ISIS is actually taxing from the revenue that these people are being given by their parent governments. It's very vulnerable to loss of funding through the low oil price and through taking away some of its assets. But of course, remember that it's fighting the Kurds, the Iraqis, the Syrians, and others who all themselves are oil states. And so they too are suffering from that loss of revenue from oil. So, you know, its relative difference is not that great. Yeah.
Next question from over on this side. Gentleman with the microphone already.
Jock Cheatham from Sydney University. I'm interested in what you've got to say about identity, and you know, you've got a Muslim, like a range of identities, Islamist identities, and then the kind of terrorist Islamist identities. And how do you see sort of people moving between those? And related to that, how does how does ISIS relate to sort of similar Islamist organisations around the world? Do some of those kind of rebrand in a sense, and how does it interact with them? Does it have a lot of allies or any?
So two really big questions. I'll try to be brief though. On identity, the identity is relatively fluid, and it's in some way, and as we say in the business, it's contingent, right? So the identity that you adopt depends in part on the circumstances where you find yourself. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the head of the Islamic State, is a great example. Yes, he's an Islamic preacher. Yes, he claims descent from the Prophet. He claims to have a doctorate in religious jurisprudence from the Islamic College of Baghdad University. That is a Ba'athist organization. His brother and his cousin were both members of Saddam's security service. He came up through the Ba'athist Hamla al-Imaniyya, the faith program, which was a Ba'athist program. So is he a Ba'athist or is he an Islamist? You know what? Depends on the day, right? So, I think that's true of many of these other guys. I was really struck when I worked in Iraq the first time, when you really look into the relationships across all the different 180 odd insurgent groups that we were fighting at that time. They all know each other. Many of them worked together before the war. They swap groups. It's much more complex than just to say that person is, X, Y, or Z. I'm sorry, I blanked on your second question. It was about the relationship. Right, the relationship. So they largely have a very fierce and competitive relationship with other Islamic groups. They're not above trying to carve out elements of another group or win them over. So just recently, a few weeks ago, about 200 fighters from a group within al-Shabaab in Somalia seceded from al-Shabaab, which is an al-Qaeda ally, and joined ISIS. We've also seen members of the Pakistani Taliban leave the Pakistani Taliban and become the ISIS wilayat in Afghanistan and Pakistan. So they try to carve off groups, but they generally have what we call a takfiri relationship with other groups. In other words, it's a sort of, since we're talking about Nietzsche, let's bring Freud in, the narcissism of small differences, right? They basically go after people that have just a very slight different interpretation of Islam and try to kill them. Ultimately, I think a weakness.
All right, now I just need to point out, not every question needs to reference a philosopher. Don't feel compelled. Maybe this gentleman here, and then we might take a few in succession. So this gentleman, and then we'll take a question from Robert. And then I think I saw a hand up right there. Yep, so we'll take those three.
David Sutton-Foxton from the No Edit Group. I'm just interested at that bottom layer, what the role of, I suppose, what we traditionally refer to as Western counterculture might be as a kind of a constraining effect on some of those destabilised and radicalised groups. I'm thinking about the graffiti artists you mentioned earlier, hip-hop artists and DJs in Tunisia who are facing kidnap and stuff like that, and where you see that role to kind of destabilise that message that's coming out from both the centralised bureaucracy of ISIS and those other tiered levels.
Okay. Getting all the easy questions today. Question from Robert.
My name's Robert Milliken. David, what advice would you give in January to President Clinton, and how do you think America's approach to all this would differ under Hillary Clinton from the Obama administrations?
Thanks, Robert. And the third question just over there.
David, my name is Ray Saad. I'm just interested in your comment on three things, if I may.
Oh, no, so just a question, sorry.
First one is you touched on the Islamic State, the word state, but you didn't talk about Islamic. They are not Islamic. Everything they do is against what the Islamic faith states. Second, further to the question there, the weapons supply, where do the weapons come from? They do have some now, I understand, but if we can contain that part of it, the weapons must come from some countries. Third one, you talked about Sunni and Shiite, is yes, but I think they do target other religions as well. They target Christians, Yazidis, and everyone who is non-Sunni, not just Sunni and Shiite. Right.
So three questions there, I think, for you to choose.
Sure. So on the graffiti counterculture question, I think it cuts both ways, right? There is certainly a strong movement. You mentioned hip-hop. There are other movements amongst young people. The average age now of ISIS recruits in the International is early to late teens. So that's nearly 10 years younger than what we saw with al-Qaeda recruits. And a lot of the CVE, the countering violent extremism stuff that's been done by governments has kind of fallen flat because it's done, anyone over 21 that's doing it, it's not working. But I think it cuts both ways because there's also a jihadi chic and a jihadi cool that you see in a lot of the ISIS recruiting materials, and it's certainly played back at us in a lot of what ISIS recruits put on YouTube and on Twitter. So yeah, it cuts both ways. President Clinton, she has tried very hard to paint herself as being more hawkish and more decisive than the Obama administration. Look, I think that's probably true as far as she herself is concerned. But remember that, an administration is not one person. It's a system. It's a briefing system and a decision-making system and hundreds of officials and thousands of government employees who are still going to be there regardless of who the president is. And much of the art of being president, I say having no prospect of ever being the president, is to manage that system and make it work. And so I think that she's likely to be a little more inclusive about some of the decision making. I do expect her to be fairly hawkish. I also expect her to have a pretty bad relationship with the Russians, by the way, because they blame her for a lot of what happened in Libya and subsequently in Syria. And that's something that Donald Trump will not have because he's been in a bit of a bromance with Vladimir Putin for the past several months. So we'll see how that pays out. And Ray, good to see you, mate. And the great question. Yeah. So I defer to your view on whether they are or not Islamic. On the question of arms, yeah, they've got a huge amount of weaponry. They have mostly gotten it from the United States via capturing it from the Iraqis and from Russia via capturing it from the Syrians. Most of their equipment is stuff that they've captured, and they have literally got hundreds of tanks, thousands of armoured vehicles, many, many tons of artillery, ammunition, and they captured entire artillery regiments from the Syrian army. They've even got a fairly robust anti-air capability, all of which they've captured from us, right, and from the Russians. So they're actually kind of self-sustaining. It's not, again, we talked about this earlier, it's not that they're a classic terrorist organisation where they've got an external sponsor and they're getting all this stuff. They're now, largely self-sustaining. They are losing that in battle, but they've still got, plenty left. Yeah, so great question.
And their own drones now, I see.
They
they've
do.
Been experimenting with.
They've got some pretty rudimentary drones, but they certainly are operating air assets. Yeah, mainly for reconnaissance right now.
Right, I've been very neglectful of this side of the room, so perhaps a question from Deborah Snow down the front, and then the lady with the glasses in the far panel, and then the lady who has very patiently been holding her hand up for a little while there as well.
Thanks, James. Deborah Snow from Fairfax. David, thanks for a fascinating address. I wanted to bring you back to the question of the refugee outflow to Europe. I've never been clear whether this is something that ISIS worries about. Do they seek to prevent it or to exploit it? Or is it an unintended consequence that they're trying to, get an advantage out of in some way? Do you have any thoughts on how Europe should be handling that? And that then leads, of course, to the question of Turkey, which, of course, is in danger of going to war, it seems, with Russia, if you believe some of the pundits. But how do these problems knit together for Western Europe?
It's a great set of questions, Deborah. Let me sort of try to address them one by one. ISIS doesn't worry about the outflow. It's not trying to stop it. It is trying to exploit it. The Syrian passports that were found in Paris at the scene of the Bataclan attack, and one that was found in Greece, I think deliberate manipulation by ISIS to try to provoke backlash against immigrants. We're looking at 1.1 million formal asylum seekers into Europe in 2015, probably at least as many illicit or illegal trying to make it in as well, and the same number will come in or more in 2016. And this is into a Europe that's already dealing with the Eurozone financial crisis and a really severe set of economic problems that are even apart from the monetary problem. And that burden of refugees falls unevenly on different countries. So Spain, Italy and Greece are really bearing the brunt of the border enforcement problem and carrying a lot of weight that they really are ill-equipped to handle. Denmark, a couple of other Scandinavian countries, Germany, are bearing the brunt of the resettlement problem. And you can see, in Cologne and other cases, how that's generating a pretty substantial backlash. That's often been characterised in the media here as a right-wing backlash. That may have once been true, but I think it's now becoming a bit more of a mainstream backlash. So I think that's a real worry for Europe, right? Because one of two things is going to happen. Either they will successfully absorb, let's say, 2 to 3 million refugees in the next couple of years, and that will put enormous strain on the European welfare state and on interstate relations within the EU and who's going to fund that and the resettlement challenges. Or they're going to fail to successfully reintegrate them, and you could have a pretty significant pattern of violence. There's already been almost 2,000 incidents of violence against asylum seekers coming into Germany over the last year. So how should they handle it? Obviously, it's a matter for European leaders, but I think they need to start thinking about how to better burden share, both in terms of border security and resettlement across the whole EU. For us sitting here in Australia, one of the biggest implications of it is the possible breakdown of the Schengen system and the fact that we may see the reimposition of internal customs controls and border controls within Europe, which would potentially break that up as a single market and could have even more significant financial implications. That, of course, knocks on to Turkey, right? And as you've said, that they are a frontline state, as they like to describe themselves here. Don't forget also they're a NATO member. So if Turkey goes to war with Russia, NATO goes to war with Russia because of the Article 5 provision of the NATO treaty. And they've already shot down a Russian aircraft. And there was another incident, not as widely reported, where Turkish aircraft crossed the border into Syria and found half a flight of Su-25s waiting to jump them on the other side, as sort of Russian combat air patrol over there, guys doing airstrikes on civilians around Aleppo. So, there's a real danger here that we're going to see complex intermingling of Turks, Russians, Syrians, and so on that could lead to a miscalculation, even if people don't want to go to war. Turkey has also significant other problems with a bit of a spike in Kurdish violence over the last year and the encroachment of ISIS onto their territory and a lot of violence inside Turkey as well. So what looked like a very strong and robust AKP government and a sort of neo-Ottoman foreign policy 2 or 3 years ago is now looking a lot more shaky. And again, that's the eastern flank of Europe as well as the northern flank of the Middle East. So not a pretty picture. Yeah.
We've probably got time for the last 2 quick questions from over this side of the room, madam.
David, this is sort of a personal question. I guess I admire your personal resilience in continuously looking into the abyss, I guess. Do you have any advice for people and institutions about how to stay so personally and I guess from a human perspective resilient in the face of a lot of negativity? And I guess apologies, this is a personal question, but I'm fascinated. Thank you.
I'm going to dodge the question a little bit. We ran a network of 4 teams in Syria and analysts in places like Cairo and Beirut and Erbil and other places. And our job was basically tracking aid and who was stealing it and refugees and working for NGOs and humanitarian aid agencies. And I found that if I let my analysts stew on what they saw on YouTube and think all night about what they're seeing in the reporting about atrocities, they got tired and exhausted and dispirited really quickly, and I had to give them pretty frequent, literally sanity breaks to be able to handle that. And then after a little while, we hit on a solution and we began to send them forward to the region to spend time with the communities that they were reporting on, and that gave people a whole different perspective because they were able to see the courage and the good humour and the sort of resiliency that people that are really suffering are displaying, and that really puts reading about it in the reporting or seeing it on YouTube in perspective, so I think that's part of it, is having a perspective of where you fit and not kind of making yourself the centre of the story. Like bad things happened in Syria and Iraq. The most important thing about that is not how it made you feel, is what happened to all those people. The other thing I think is maintaining a sense of proportion and recognising that things are bad, but they're not uniquely bad, and we've seen this before, we'll probably see it again, and trying to understand the drivers in a sort of more academic way of what we're seeing on the ground. And sometimes having that academic distance can actually help people sustain personal engagement longer. Yeah. So yeah, great question. And anyone that's doing analysis of any of this kind of work has to confront that. And the other question is, do you take sides? I try really hard not to take sides in domestic politics in Australia or the US or anything else, only because I don't think professional soldiers should be doing that, frankly, and also because it's already too politicised and we're talking past each other. But on the ground, you've got to take sides, you know, and when you see what is happening to people in the region, it's you know, impartiality amongst those different players, you know, it's a pose, and you need to say, no, actually, these guys are bad, these guys are less bad, but you know, these are the guys that we need to be worried about first, and we'll get to these guys second.
Look, I think that's the right place to finish this conversation.
Oh, there's one more.
Oh, okay, hang on.
And it's from SBS.
I know you've been a very patient man, but we're out of time, unfortunately. So I think we'll finish the conversation there. An absolute tour de force, David. We'll now have some time for you to chat to David over drinks. I'm not sure he'll be able to sign all 230 copies of the book, but he might sign a couple. But please stick around. Before I thank David for his presentation tonight, let me just thank a few other people. Kevin McCann and Macquarie, thank you for letting us use this fantastic space, and to Chris Hemming and the team who make everything so seamless getting people in and who will no doubt seamlessly get us out as well. Thank you very much for letting us be here. It's a beautiful building. To Black Ink, Anna Lenski and your crew, who've been very busy getting David all over Australia over the last week or so, on and off Q&A without too much trouble last night. Thank you for letting us be the host for the launch of his book in Sydney. To the staff at the US Studies Centre, April Parmalee, our new Communications Director, and her team, Kath, Mara, Andrew Kwan, Tegan, and the others, thank you very much for your efforts tonight and for keeping us on track. I should mention the next event that the US Studies Centre will be hosting is with Anne-Marie Slaughter, formerly of the US State Department, Dean at Princeton at their School of International Relations, wrote an excellent essay on why women can't have it all. She's speaking at the University on US foreign policy on the 4th of March. If you sign up to our newsletter, which you can do either outside or on our website, you'll be eligible for reduced price tickets for that, and we promise to only spam you once a month with the latest and greatest of what's coming out of the US that Australians should be aware of. Ladies and gentlemen, we've had a masterful presentation tonight covering a lot of ground. The book is superb, you'll enjoy reading it, but please join me in thanking David Kilcullen. Thank you.